When I was a student, I loved being graded. Check pluses, A pluses. It was a positive experience for me. It made me feel smart and full of possibilities for my life. For my son, who learned differently, grading was a negative experience. Mostly minuses, except that one time his science teacher gave him an F plus. Being graded made my son feel dumb and at times hopeless. Grading hasn't changed much from when I was graded to when my son was graded to now. It's still being used as rewards and consequences to compare students. And the lowest grades leave scars of feeling not good enough that last a lifetime. Today, a major issue in public education is that teachers are using inequitable and demotivating grading practices that are harming our most underserved. In the United States, our students of color, our students with learning disabilities, our LGBTQIA+ students, and our low-income students are 2 to 5 times more likely to drop out of school. These students believe they're not smart, they lose hope, and they leave public education feeling they have limited possibilities for their lives. Researchers have found that grades are one of the leading factors to our dropout rate. For 20 years as a middle school teacher, I never questioned my grading practices. I graded the same way my mentor teacher taught me, and she probably graded the same way her mentor teacher taught her, and so on. Grading practices still weren't a concern for me when I moved to teaching high school about 8 years ago. But I was concerned about the 12 students who failed my courses that year. I felt like I failed every one of them. Another teacher told me students have a right to fail, suggesting students need to change, not the teachers. But I don't believe that. I believe I need to do everything I can, that my students have the right for me to do everything I can to help them find the possibilities within themselves. So, I worked on changing my curriculum to make it more inclusive. I worked on improving my lesson design to make it more engaging. And I adjusted my pedagogy to make it focused on the students, as all of these folks have mentioned, to focus on them, getting to know them first. And my failure rate decreased by 25%. The next year, I finally considered my grading practices. I only changed one thing: no late penalty. None. I accepted late work graciously from my students. And my failure rate decreased another 17%. I made even more changes when I read this book called Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. It inspired me actually to shift my grading practices significantly. I stopped grading students at the beginning of the year before I had taught them anything. I learned that when I graded everything at the beginning of the year, I was grading them on what they had learned previously, not in my class. The biggest impact I saw with this was with a quiet English learner who, in traditional grading practices, not knowing the English language very well, would have been failing by the quarter with limited possibilities to pass my standards grade level class at the semester. This English learner's writing was just at a different developmental place than the grade level standards. Not grading the early formative practice work gave her the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them. Focusing on feedback, not points, created a safe space to learn. And her growth by the end of that semester was amazing. And she met several grade level standards. And I stopped putting zeros in the grade book. The student who taught me the most about this was a pink-haired boy who had submitted nothing, 0, within the first 2 months of school. I had been using the traditional practice of putting zeros in the grade book, which motivates many students to get their work in pretty quickly. But for some, like my pink-haired boy, it seemed to motivate him to avoid the work even more. Halfway through that semester, I learned about this practice called minimum grading from that Grading for Equity book. It's where you just put a score in that's just below passing, not quite, but just below. I got so excited about it, I immediately went back and changed all the zeros in my grade book, which were quite a few for that pink-haired boy, to 50% with a comment, need to submit. Within a week, my pink-haired boy turned in a major writing assignment. It was filled with evidence that he actually learned things in my class. When I asked him why he finally turned something in, he said, because I thought I finally had a chance. I couldn't stop talking about grading practices and that Grading for Equity book with fellow educators. In the last year, I've partnered with my school, the Department of Education, and other equity-focused organizations to present my search for more equitable and motivating grading practices to over 300 educators. Through my presentations and published writing, I'm helping other teachers across the state rethink grading too. Last year, as I continued to learn, I tried out co-creating grades. Do it, try it, it's fun. I had my students set their own goals for reading, writing, and communicating, because I'm an English teacher, and track their own progress instead of me tracking everything. No grades, I just conferenced with them and gave support. At my schools required grading checkpoints, because yes, there still is a system of grading. My students and I sat down together, we examined their evidence of learning, and we collaborated on their grade. I learned the grading is not for me to judge them, but for them to focus on their own individual growth. I surveyed my students to find out how these grading shifts were working for them. Compared to traditional grading, 95% of my students felt that this individual growth-based grading practice I was experimenting with was actually more fair and unbiased, more equitable. And 84% of my students also said it was more motivating. Most importantly, this past year, only 3 students failed my courses, which was a 75% decrease from where my failure rate years before. Last year, when the pandemic started, we heard from our administrators and our state department education officials, do no harm with your grading. Do no harm. What does that suggest about the way that we graded before the pandemic? We cannot go back to grading practices that harm students. Students like my ADHD dyslexic son, my quiet English learner, my pink-haired boy, and our most vulnerable students. We cannot go back to doing what we've always done without question when we have students who are failing before graduation. As we move forward, all educators must rethink and adjust their grading practices so that all students are empowered. And every single one can find the possibility within themselves and for themselves.